Hi everyone, I'm Dr.Animaction. Welcome to the latest entry in my Personnel Office series, where I take a look at G.I. Joes in a real context. Moving on through the figure lineup in the 1982 insert catalog brings us to the Joe's first anti-armor soldier today, with Zap. Let's dive into this look and see how well he stacks up against the real world. We'll start this look by checking out the front of Zap's original blister card. Kind of like what happened with Stalker, I've got to complain about Zap right out of the gate. We can see that he's listed here as a bazooka soldier in the 1982 lineup. Unfortunately, the U.S. Army phased out bazookas almost entirely by the mid-1960s, pretty much 20 years before Zap showed up. By the time the first series of Joes were released, there were several other weapon systems being employed that were much more powerful and user-friendly, but we'll talk more about that when we get to his qualifications. Before we move on though, we'll chat about his codename for a second. This one is pretty easy and definitely appropriate for someone in the anti-armor role. During World War II, and for a while after, I'll admit to not knowing exactly how long, though it wasn't used anymore when I was enlisted, Zap was infantry slang for destroying something. So yeah, someone carrying a bazooka would be charged, no pun intended, with zapping tanks and fortifications. Thumbs up for the codename. Let's flip things over and take a look at his actual file card though. Well, here you can all see that RA on his service number that I talked about in the Stalker video, so we know Zap came from the regular army. And moving down, we see that like most of the Joes in this series, he has a primary and two secondary specialties, all of which are in what the Army considers to be the combat arms. He's the first character of the year, though, that doesn't have infantry as his primary, and instead we see it as secondary with his prime role being engineer. For the first time in this video series, having both of these as actual MOSs would actually make sense, for the most part at least. Infantry can serve as little as a 2-year enlistment, meaning that he could have reclassified to engineer and still have been an E4 like it shows a little further down. The other details on the card support this as well, since it lists him as being both the Joe's anti-armor and demolitions expert. Anti-armor is predominantly an infantry role, and demolitions absolutely belongs to engineers. At this point in military history, this probably means that his primary MOS is 12 Bravo, which is a combat engineer, and his secondary MOS is 11 Hotel, which back then was anti-armor infantryman, though that MOS apparently doesn't exist anymore. That's probably because the weapons that they trained in and used have all been replaced at this point. We'll expand on both of these in a minute when we move further down the card. The one that doesn't make sense to me here though is artillery as a secondary. There's nothing else on the card that hints about him having any background or responsibilities in anything resembling artillery, and frankly the original Joes really didn't have any use for artillery personnel. Honestly, I think that someone just got overzealous assigning the first series of Joe's specialties, and we're probably safe in just completely dismissing this one. The Zap character is a whole lot more realistic without it, and this was the only year that characters were given more than 2 anyway. Moving on down the card a little, we see that Zap is listed as an E4, so like Grunt and Flash, probably a specialist. For those of you wondering why I tend to lean towards specialist for all of the E4s instead of corporal, it's simple. Smart soldiers don't want to be a corporal, at least not in the Army. It's the same rank as a specialist, but considered a non-commissioned officer, so it comes with more responsibility without necessarily any more respect and definitely not any more pay. If you get promoted to corporal, it just means that when a job comes around that they need an NCO for and no sergeant wants to do it, they have you to defer to. Meanwhile, a specialist rank insignia is lovingly referred to as a sham shield, because it means you outrank the privates around you, but you don't have any responsibilities like an NCO. I always want to assume the Joes only take smart soldiers, and smart soldiers stay specialists. Anyway, like I said with the other E4s in this series so far, that probably means he's got 3 or 4 years of active duty service. Plenty of time to have gotten both MOSs. A little further down though, we see a list of schools that include Engineer School, which is where he'd have gotten the 12 Bravo MOS, Advanced Infantry Training, which is just where you get your infantry specialization, and in Zap's case where he became an 11 Hotel, and Ordnance School. A lot of G.I. Joe file cards in 1982 and beyond all like to list Ordnance School for characters, but they really probably shouldn't. Ordnance is a support role in the Army, and Ordnance School is where you go to learn how to handle ammunition and explosives to properly store, transport, and issue them out. The only Joes who should really have Ordnance listed are guys like Tripwire, since explosive ordnance disposal is a component of the school. Instead, the school that should probably be listed here is called Sapper Leader Course, which is a 4-week class for combat engineers. One of the main skills that engineers learn in it is advanced and expedient demolitions, which sounds a lot more practical for the type of work that Zap does. I'll give the card the benefit of the doubt though and assume that's what it was going for. Let's keep moving through and look at his weapons qualifications. He's got the standard M14, M16, and M1911A1, which as I've said is pretty infantry normal other than the M14 being outdated. He also has the M79 grenade launcher listed, which is another outdated piece of hardware that the Army phased out in the mid-1970s. The problem with the M79 was that it was a single shot and restricted the operator to just indirect fire. It was replaced with the M203 grenade launcher, which is the one you always see in movies attached to the bottom of an M16. With one of these, you got both indirect and direct fire capabilities. It's more likely Zap would have this qualification, since all infantrymen train with one, and there's usually one per infantry team of 4 to 5 soldiers. He's also got the M72 LAW listed here, which are single-use disposable rocket launchers, LAW standing for Light Anti-Armor Weapon. Essentially, they're the things that replaced actual bazookas, since they were a lot easier to transport and use. The problem with bazookas was that they really took 2 people to be effective for more than one shot, since the guy firing couldn't really reload, at least not easily. So they were replaced with recoilless rifles, and eventually just rocket launchers like these. He also has the XM71A TOW and the XM47 Dragon missile systems listed here. Both of these are anti-armor or anti-fortification weapons, kind of. Real-world versions are actually the BGM-71 and the M47, as the X designator is usually used for experimental systems and dropped when they go into wide production. The Dragon was carried by infantry and was a single-use tube connected to a reusable sight, but it was bulky and heavy and nothing at all like what Zap's figure came with. The TOW was a way bigger, way heavier system that was either vehicle-mounted or set up as stationary on a tripod. I can't really see either system being the kind of thing an agile unit like the Joes would have much use for, but as an 11 hotel, being qualified in both would make sense for Zap. Now though, let's move along and look at his actual gear, checking out both the equipment he came with and the figure's molded features. We'll start with the molded pieces. Zap seems to be wearing the belt from an LBE, but not the suspenders, which would really only make sense if he was using it to carry a pistol or ammo. But he doesn't seem to have either, so it would be pretty unnecessary. He does have this brown harness, but that would likely be representative of the shoulder straps for his backpack. The chest strap there is for heavier loads to shift the weight somewhat. He's also got those sleeve and leg pouches that the designers of this wave of figures were so fond of, so who knows what he's got in there. The only other item of note here is his brown boots, which Grunt also had, but as that was my first video in the series, I hope you cut me some slack for not pointing it out. I should have, because these things are completely out of date. In fact, the Army switched over to all black leather boots all the way back in 1957, so it's pretty unlikely that any of the Joes would have been wearing them at this point. Taking a look at his equipment, we find a helmet, which is a military staple for every soldier, the promised bazooka, which looks like it came straight out of World War II, and a small backpack with what look like spare rounds. That's it though, so assuming he already has a round loaded, that makes him good for 5 shots in a fight. His backpack also has a couple other small details molded into it that don't really look like much, but I think we can assume represent some explosives and associated components. Overall, Zap is a pretty accurate representation of a real-world soldier, only one from the 40s or 50s instead of the 80s. It would really only take a couple of changes to bring him up to date though. First, he needs to get rid of that bazooka and get a standard infantry loadout and weapon, but supplemented maybe with a LAW or something, and then also give him a satchel for his demolitions equipment. Do that and he'd fit right in. But there's my look at Zap, and how he compares to a real-world soldier with the same jobs and duties. I'd actually go ahead and say that he's pretty realistic, even if he's a little displaced in time. He's actually one character that the cartoon did a better job with than the toy, making him more focused on the demolitions aspect of his job, so points there to Sunbow. Next time presents me with a bit of a challenge though, as we take a look at our first Joe that's not just an army dude in a green uniform. Check back then for an in-depth look at Scarlet. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned and stay tuned, as in cartoons. Later.